Without any further ado, I would like to present Dr. Gavin Wood.
Thank you, Bill. Still a bit of a shame that we can't all gather in person like the first couple of Sub0s, but I have a lot of faith that next year things will be a little bit back to how they were. I'm going to use my little bit of time up front to talk to you. I'm going to cover three things. First, I want to just reiterate what it is that we're trying to do with Substrate and with the parachain model that Substrate was made for. Second, I want to talk a little bit about what the status is of some of the Substrate related projects that Parity is working on. And third, I want to talk more broadly about some of the currents that we're seeing in the industry at present and how that relates to Substrate and Polkadot. So yeah, let's start with a little bit about like what Substrate and particularly the parachain model is for. This came up a bit in the last few months with a with our industry heating up with a few new projects on the block and a clear idea of what it is that Substrate gives, I think is always worth to have in mind. So Substrate built parachains are really have these four very important attributes, and we've got to really I want to dig a little bit into each one so that everyone here is very clear about why it is that we're doing what we're doing. Unstoppable, upgradable, unlimited, and feeless. So let's dig in a little bit. Unstoppable. So Substrate-based parachains and Substrate chains in general are crucially, they're very decentralized, right? Now, we can compare this to a lot of other projects that are not really designed to be that decentralized. They're designed to be a bit decentralized. I suspect that the project leads often are sort of trying this hybrid model in order to see just how close they can get to the regulators before they're determined to be just too centralized. But with Substrate, we really want to live the true peer-to-peer dream and make something that is actually unstoppable, which is why, you know, all of the nodes are full nodes sort of have all of the data, why validators, why it's easy to become a validator on a Substrate network, and why we are dedicating a lot of effort to ensuring that light clients are not just viable, but also efficient and performant. So we are trying to achieve scalability with decentralization. We're not going to trade off any decentralization in order to get some initial bit of scalability. The next thing I want to talk about is upgradability. Now, most of you will, this will be old news too, but I think it's nonetheless very important to emphasize that this is a key feature of Substrate and Polkadot, and something that we want to, we view as being like a key part of its mantra and ethos. It's a meta protocol. Substrate chains are meta protocols. Polkadot is a meta protocol, being as it's based on a substrate chain. So this allows us to upgrade, update, assimilate new technology very efficiently, very effectively. There's a couple of pictures to try and get this in, drive this home. You know, we see a lot of chains. Making those upgrades is a bit like trying to run in a very muddy field, whereas we get to be the illustrated kite surfer. A very important difference of the Substrate parachain model is, especially as it's compared to the smart contract model. And this is a question I get asked about a lot. So it may possibly be a question that you get asked about as parachain teams and Substrate chain teams. So I want to make it super clear. The Substrate parachain model is a free execution model. This basically means you're leasing out a chunk of time on what amounts to a distributed CPU core. And this is a lot different. This is fundamentally different to what the smart contract gives you, which is a transaction execution model, which is essentially where users can pay to have your code executed for them. As a free execution model, you're guaranteed that you get scheduled in time slices, and you're guaranteed that scheduling happens at regular intervals, every 6 seconds, for example, for a Polkadot parachain. And this is crucial in giving you the power and freedom in order to decide how your application should work and implement it as you need to. Crucially, you are in control of what transactions get executed, not the other way around. On a smart contract chain, the transactions are in control. And if you can't get that transaction through for whatever reason, or rather not you, but your users, then your application simply won't run. And that can be that can make a huge difference as to what applications are actually viable. I mean, the sort of things that a free execution model can give you, go through them: on-chain scheduling, transaction prioritization, ordering, and so forth. In short, facilities like on runtime upgrade, on initialize, on finalize simply cannot be supported in an Ethereum-style smart contract system. And that's something that you really can get very easily in Substrate. Finally, feeless. Now, this isn't quite what it's in, because of course a lot of Substrate chains have fees, but it comes in two key points. The first one is that as a Substrate-based parachain, once your chain has secured a parachain slot lease, then you do not have to expose the DOT token or the KSM token, or indeed any token, to your users. Now, of course, most teams will have their own tokens that they want to use in order to charge users transaction fees, and that's fine. But in principle, it's entirely your chain's decision. You do not need to expose users to any transaction fees at all. In principle, you can restrict your user transactions to some manageable amount for your chain, without bringing tokens in at all. You could have, for example, certification of users. You could have an oracle that checks that the user has a sufficient, has a sufficient degree of individuality that they won't be able to Sybil attack and therefore DOS your chain. There are ways of doing this, and this opens the door to feeless applications running on parachains, and that is a very interesting path indeed, because in my mind that would open the door to mass appeal. At the moment, we can only really appeal to people who don't mind owning tokens or already have some. That's, I think, quite a limiting factor. Okay, so that's broadly speaking how I see Substrate and Polkadot, the parachain model, deliver some really crucial and fundamental differences. The next thing I want to talk a bit about is just talk the status of some parts of Substrate relevant technologies. This is, forgive me, this is actually not that much to do with Substrate per se. This is more to do with Polkadot, but I figure most of the people here won't mind too much. First thing I want to talk about is the status of the bridges. Very relevant for Substrate projects. This will allow Substrate teams to connect their solo chains between each other, and also, if for whatever reason they are not planning on getting a parachain slot just yet, it could also provide connectivity, admittedly less secure and a bit more latent, but connectivity to the relay chains. Bridges are also a very important piece of technology for some stuff that we want to get done next year, but now is not quite the point to talk about that. So the bridges status. The bridge audit is about 2 weeks from being completed, without very many issues being found at all. This is actually, I believe, the second audit. The first one was done some months back, so this is basically the audit of the corrections. There will be a bridge being deployed soon from Rococo to the bridge testnet Wococo, just to make sure that works. But we do expect a relay-to-relay chain bridge deploying before the end of the year for Polkadot and Kusama. That assumes, of course, that the last 2 weeks of the audit don't bring in any more significant issues, but that's the expectation. And the parachain to parachain bridge hopefully deploying early next year. There will be an additional information on this a bit later on in the conference, I believe, but yeah, there's the summary. Next thing is the XCM status. So XCM v2 is delivered. It's part of Polkadot 0911. This brings in most of the core features of what we've been asked for. Asynchronous error handling. So basically, this means that you can have some on-chain code run in case of some error that happens on a remote chain. And it's done in a relatively nice way, so it's all done with dispatchables. Status reporting, so allowing the status of some XCM instruction to be reported back to some other chain, which presumably will want to register it with some code handler. Asset trapping, which is essentially just remembering the contents of the holding register at the end of an XCM message. A lot of the time, an XCM, whether it's through an error or just accidentally, with perhaps a message that wasn't crafted properly, at the end of the message execution, some assets are left in the holding register. This allows for those to be remembered and then later claimed. Exception handling, there's now exception handling actually built into the language model of XCM. We're now using a virtual machine model. It's a bit more, I think, comprehensible and extensible than before. And one of the big ones is it's got version management. So this allows different XCM versions to coexist within a multi-chain network. I've also done the specification for version 2 as well. Next is the status of the parachains. I know this is of importance to many of you here. Parachains, the parachain code is now considered feature complete in that all of the security mechanisms from the Polkadot spec are implemented, tested, and audited. So yes, the audit's complete. The corrections from the audit, about halfway done, expected to be finished by November. And we do expect an initial deployment of this feature complete security code onto Kusama very quickly. And we want to leave it 3 weeks before we would want to see it in production, but we don't expect any significant problems. So that should give some idea of the timeline that we would expect before we expect any parachains to go live on Polkadot. In terms of our opinion on the production status of this code, we think it's reasonable to be confident that parachains be technologically viable from December. And we think a deployment to Kusama by the end of October is something that we should expect. And so from a technological perspective, I think it's not unreasonable for Polkadot to begin preparations for the lease period 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, for that batch of auctions to begin being prepared for more or less now. We think an ongoing auction schedule will be sensible. We think the number of parachains on Polkadot should remain up to only 3/4 of what's on Kusama. in order to keep Kusama as Polkadot's canary network, at least until the code is mature and we have a much better idea about the amount of parachains and transactional throughput and message throughput that it can handle on the current infrastructure. We think shorter auctions for the initial parachain scale-up period would not be unreasonable. In general, we would stick to what we've already was published in the past, so a roughly 2-week per auction schedule. Good. And looking forward, I want to just talk a little bit about some of the currents and trends. Not very many, actually, only a couple. In the industry as a whole, and how it relates to what we're doing with Substrate, what we're working on, and what you can expect from us over the course of the next 12 months or so. One thing that I've noticed is that in the search for high transactional throughput, there are quite a few chains that have lost sight of the fact that decentralization, and for that matter, security, are not optional features, right? You can get a lot more transaction throughput if you're willing to trade off the effective decentralization of your network, if you're willing to trade off the peer-to-peer aspects of your network. There's a reason that Ethereum 2 is taking so long. Actually, there's several reasons. One of them is that they're doing it, they're not willing to trade off, as we are not, the decentralization aspects of the network. And if you're not willing to do that, then the architecture, the design, particularly out of the security, has to be a lot more thought through. So when you see networks claiming large TPS that are supposedly public networks, I would take any comparisons with quite a lot of salt. And oftentimes, it's really not an apples for apples comparison. If we look at the currents of the global regulation, we can see a few things. Now, I've read a couple reports about this. I don't claim to be an expert. I certainly don't claim to be a lawyer, but there are some things that crop up in these reports, in these policy statements, that seem, in my mind, to make some sense. If we look at the FATF, which is an international body, it's roughly the G20, I believe, of nations that get their heads together, or give some faceless bureaucrats and get their heads together. We see some fairly, if we look at what they're saying, we see some fairly clear policy. The good news is that software development and generic keeping, so maintaining of a network, is considered something that untouchable, is considered something that should be allowed to continue without any regulation at all. And this is a good thing, right? Because this is our bread and butter as developers and people who want to deploy these kinds of peer-to-peer networks. It's crucial that these activities remain free and unfettered. However, it's also pretty clear that global regulators are taking a very critical eye to some other things that I think most peer-to-peer, most decentralized projects have at least dabbled in a bit, many of which rely very distinctly on some of these. One is service provision. This is basically RPCs, wallets, app sites. Another is multi-sigs. So like DAOs are often sort of named example of this, where you've got like a bunch of named personnel who can decide how to spend the DAO's treasury. This is also the case with Polkadot Kusama. Custodians, hosted wallets, and non-peer-to-peer stablecoins being the obvious two. And also, it seems easy fire is what I've called here, but basically apps, wallets that are trying to utilizing centralized mechanisms, trying to make the decentralized apps easier to use. And I think these probably one of the later things, but these will still, from what I'm reading, come under some scrutiny. The service provision is one of the most interesting ones because, of course, decentralized networks that are, I would say, fairly legitimately peer-to-peer, such as Ethereum, still make a heavy reliance on centralized RPC services, and oftentimes centralized wallets and sites to host decentralized applications. And I think these, certainly looking at the language that is being used by global regulators, it seems that these will come under substantial scrutiny in the not too distant future. One thing I think is certain: the more centralized you are, the more chance you have of regulators knocking at your door, insisting that you become licensed. And the more peer-to-peer, then the lower the chance. So pushing towards peer-to-peer seems reasonable. Another thing I think that it's quite likely, again, reading some of these documents, it seems that crypto projects that are not sufficiently peer-to-peer, that are deemed sufficiently centralized, will probably require licensing, and those licensing requirements I would expect will be of the similar kind of standard to banking requirements. If this is true, this would imply that most crypto projects in their current form may not actually be able to exist in the next year or two. I mean, I think the timeline for this is probably 2 to 3 years before it gets properly enforceable, but still, it's good to plan for the future, especially when the technology that you need to mitigate these risks is quite difficult to implement. At Parity, we are committed to peer-to-peerifying everything. We want to make sure that our technology is in line with what is considered not needed for regulation. And this means that we have a lot of emphasis now, but also going forward on these what I would call almost like weak points within the decentralization, particularly bootstrapping, boot nodes, point of centralization there. RPC nodes, also a point of centralization. We're managing that with light clients, and particularly in browser light clients, which I hope we're going to have a nice introduction to you all for in this very conference. With governance, particularly trying to ensure that we can have on-chain decentralized governance that doesn't fall foul of any kind of potential multi-sig regulations, and also privacy, so privacy mechanisms such as mixnets. One thing that I want to make very clear is that solutions that are built on Substrate should be true Web3 solutions, so actually peer-to-peer. And similarly, for Polkadot, we want that to be the first peer-to-peer, secure and scalable free execution platform. And with that, I just want to leave you with the 4 tenets of Polkadot parachains and Substrate chains: unstoppable, upgradable, unlimited, and feeless. Thank you very much. That was my keynote.
Okay, thank you. That was very interesting, and we have quite a few questions from the audience if you have some time. So first on this last, so first on this last topic about regulation, do you see risks to developers and like centralized solutions for development such as GitHub for these projects, or do you see it at a different level?
I think centralized solutions that are very clearly geared towards general development are probably not going to have much of an issue. I don't think they're going to start. I don't think regulation is going to start coming in against like the Rust language, because the Rust language happens to be used for Substrate. I do think that I'll continue on that thread. I also don't think that teams that engage purely in technological development, so basically in coding, software development, and software releases, I don't think are going to be a big target anytime soon. I would hope indefinitely, but I do think that any service provision that is to do with transaction facilitation, not just processing, could become a target, could come under scrutiny, and therefore it's important to try to minimize the degree to which we as teams operating in the space have any significant control over the transactions and the use of any value that exists within our networks.
A couple of other questions, two actually that we had that would just like to clarify some of the things that you mentioned. So you had mentioned lease periods 6 through 9, but I think some people didn't understand how lease periods work. Could you just go over what that means exactly?
Sure. It's that was the typo. It should actually be 6 through 13. But yeah, the lease periods are essentially time slots for parachains. So each lease period on Polkadot is 3 months, and we are currently at, as it happens, I think we're just approaching the midpoint of lease period 5. We should be lease period 5 should be ending, and lease period 6 should be beginning around the middle of December. And we think that basically the middle of December would be a not unreasonable point to have, from a technological point of view, to have parachains be live on Polkadot. I mean, we would actually say probably early December, but as it happens, mid-December would not be, we think, a bad plan.
Also, one of your slides, you had mentioned both relay to relay bridges as well as parachain to para to para bridges. So is this using XCM? Is this something different? Like, how would this differ? Like a bridge between a parachain and a parachain differ from using XCM, or is that actually part of the same thing?
XCM is a message format, and this as a message format should be usable regardless of the transport mechanism. XCM is usable both for communicating upwards to a relay chain, downwards from a relay chain to a parachain, sideways using XCMP from parachain to parachain, and also over bridges, which is another transport mechanism. The relay to relay bridge is essentially just saying that there would be actually on the relay chain itself a pallet that allowed the relay chain to send messages to another relay chain. Now these messages would be pretty secure, but in principle we may have they're never going to be as secure as parachain to parachain within the same relay chain network, just because they have actually the same sovereignty, the same consensus mechanism, the same securing capital. When I mentioned the parachain to parachain bridging, what this means is that the bridge would sit from a parachain on Polkadot to a parachain on Kusama. So it's still bridging Polkadot and Kusama, but it's doing so without interfering with the relay chain itself. It's doing it all within the confines of a single parachain, and eventually this would obviously be a system parachain or a common good parachain, and it would, in principle, should be able to hold more than one bridge. It's the general idea is that we would have a bridge hub that would sit in this common good parachain, bridging over to not just Polkadot to Kusama, but also Polkadot to many other networks, and similarly on the Kusama side, from Kusama to networks beyond Polkadot.
Okay, yeah, bringing that vision of a multi-chain world to fruition. So another question we had is, what is going to be the focus on substrate development over the next year or so? I know we've seen, I know we're going to see a lot of things that people are working on, but would you say there are particular areas of focus that you're working on?
Yeah, so the main things I think that we're going to see are in terms of like a renewed focus. Obviously, there are bridges. There's the continuation of some of the frame stuff, in particular upgrades and migrations. But a renewed focus will be placed on Substrate and its peer-to-peer decentralization technologies. In particular, ensuring that we have the right governance apparatus to be able to have agile, efficient, inclusive, accessible governance without relying on centralizing mechanisms like the council and potentially even like the technical committee. So I think one of the things that we're going to see over the next 12 months is a evolution and iteration in the governance building blocks that Substrate provides. A second thing would be the light client. I don't know, many of you may or may not be aware of the Small Dot project, which aims to be a Substrate light client that is very efficient and very nippy. It can be compiled into WebAssembly and sit quite happily within a browser window. We'll also be focusing one of the sort of newer projects yet to be commissioned, but soon will be the initial bootstrapping and discovery, so that we can find boot nodes for a Substrate chain without having to have them hard coded into the code base. And one other initiative that I'm quite excited about next year. It's not strictly the Substrate feature or code base, but is a Substrate and Polkadot centric education program. That's something that's in its early phases at the moment, but I would hope that over the next 12 months, we have really a very world standard, gold standard education program for people who want to really get to grips with Substrate, Polkadot, parachains, blockchain technology in general, crypto, game theory, and Rust. And this is, I think, something that we've obviously got some things already in the ecosystem, but this would really be the icing on top of the cake.
Yeah, I'm very curious just to follow up on that. Do you have any ideas about some of these new governance primitives, these decentralizing governance primitives? Or this is still the very early phases of thinking about that?
No, indeed, there is very much some ideas. And this is something that I wouldn't want to say that we are at the point immediately before implementation, where we have a very coherent design, but we're also, I would say, we have fairly fleshed out ideas. One of the, I think actually the main idea is to try to follow a more liquid democracy model, where we have, where we emphasize vote delegation, which is in effect what the council is doing anyway, right? So in addition, and it's also technology that we already have implemented. You can already delegate votes, but we would, I think, try to make it so that vote delegation is much more agile, meaning that you wouldn't have to manually undelegate before you're able to move funds, and you wouldn't necessarily have to pay anything to delegate. Secondly, and in addition, so building on this delegation to try to get people involved in the general referendum model would be to move beyond the adaptive quorum biasing and move beyond the fixed time with potential fast tracking model that we have now into a variable time limit mechanism with a essentially allowing referenda to end early if they have a sufficiently high turnout and are sufficiently in favor or against. So essentially, for a referendum to end within an hour, there would have to be an exceptionally high turnout and exceptionally biased towards approve or reject. within that turnout. But as time goes on, we would accept a lower turnout and a bit of a less of a bias one way to the other, in order to allow for the early ending of the referendum. And then the idea is that if it played through and had the entire 2 weeks or a month or however long it's meant to go for by default, and still hadn't sort of early exited, then it would exit without anything happening. So it would essentially fail.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, like removing any individuals or like more there's some really interesting plans for governance. Thank you. So this is an interesting question. It's kind of vague though. So I guess you can take it however you want. But what are some ways that individuals can help increase this decentralization and help promote Substrate and the technological adoption of the Polkadot ecosystem? Like, what would you give as advice for people who want that?
Yeah, it's hard without knowing the specific skill set of any given individual. If they are, a great coder, then lending a hand either to the core technology within Substrate or to building great products on Substrate. If they're not maybe so much of a coder, but sort of a good networker, which meets a lot of people, do a lot of talking, then presenting on the key differences. Evangelism, going to other developers and letting them know, right, well, this is why Substrate's a good idea, this is why Polkadot is different, I think is crucial. And generally, if they're non-technical, entirely non-technical, then just general evangelism of peer-to-peer and decentralization as a whole. So like, why is decentralization a good thing? Why is doing things in a peer-to-peer fashion a good thing? Why do we not want to have to trust authorities? Why do we? What's the problem with authorities? Talking about nexuses of power, talking about the potential for corruption, the potential for mistakes to have magnifying effects the greater the centralization is. And this is stuff that isn't specifically to do with technology. This is just stuff. This is like classic sociology almost. It's like why it's not such a great thing to place so much power into the hands of so few. I think if you Google for decentralization and social democracy and so on, you will probably find quite a lot of material on this.
All right. Well, thank you very much. That was a great speech and some great answers to questions.